Hey there, welcome back to my room again. Today we're going to be doing a little breakdown of Syn. So first, I want to talk about the song structure of Syn, because while Fool was pretty simple with its kind of like verse, chorus, bridge, chorus thing, like, the kind of like standard song structure, Syn is a little bit more complicated. I'd say probably like 9 sections, really. If you're thinking kind of like verse, refrain, guitar verse, bridge A, big refrain, bridge B, and then like that outro section that's really kind of like an overture between Syn and Fool, then that's 9. So let's dive right in. Let's just start off with what the guitars are doing. Throughout the verses, the acoustic guitar and the electric guitar actually kind of do the same thing. Leading up to the first verse, the two acoustics are just playing their 2 chords, which are B major 7 and F sharp major, and a little melody on top of it, and so that sounds like this. And then when the electric comes in at the same time as the start of Miriam's verse, it plays those same 2 chords but just strums them with no melody. All the guitars play slightly more intense versions of the same thing in the refrains as the song goes on, and they're always playing a G sharp minor and C sharp dominant 7. Versus the second refrain. Then there's not really any like fresh guitar parts until the solo, where those 3 guitars continue to play the same thing, and then a new guitar comes in with the guitar solo. And the solo part is pretty much identical from the first half to the second half, but during the second half those vocals come in. Then arguably the most interesting part of the song would be Bridge A, where we actually go into 5/4, and there's some fun harmonies with the acoustics and the electrics during this bridge. Those pair really well with the synths, which Clayton will talk about in his section. Moving on, we've got the big refrain, which is just primarily that G sharp minor, and then a little bit of that dominant chord at the end again. Then we go into the bridge B guitar parts, which honestly are some of my favorite guitar parts in the whole song. Those were written by Clayton. That sounds like this. And as you heard, the acoustics join in on the second half of Bridge B. Then in the overture, the acoustic guitar actually plays those same chords, but now the tempo is 120, so instead of that kind of like built up, like released feeling, it's this relaxed, slow flow. And that sounds like this. An interesting note about the acoustic tone for this overture section compared to the acoustic tone that goes throughout the rest of the song. For the most of the song, the acoustic kind of holds this like more upper frequency kind of content with the like pick style kind of playing, versus at the end of it, it's more like the style of acoustic that's played in the bridge on Fool. where it's fingers and like a lot of the noise that comes from it is like that finger noise. On top of that, there's a guitar that's going through this reverb, this realm. On the caramel guitar setting, I think it's a really unique tone, and that sounds like this. Just a nice little dinky gross boy. Onto the bass part, it starts off just kind of playing root notes, just kind of slowly and soft, and like that flat wound tone really kind of brings out mostly that low end, just that kind of round bass sound I thought really fit with this, like the chill start. Then later on in the song, when it gets more intense, the parts go up the strings horizontally rather than vertically, if that makes sense. For the most part, the bass doesn't really take up a lot of space in the song, up until when we get to the end of the big refrain, where it goes really high up on the lowest string and then drops all the way down to almost the bottom of the lowest string to give this really like tension released kind of feeling. Next, let's talk about the vocals. As you know, our good friend Miriam featured on this track, and she just absolutely killed it. I love the timbre of her voice, really sounds nice with this song. The production on the vocals, for the most part, was pretty straightforward. There's like a delay and like a reverb, but one of the subtle effects that I think really changes the tone of the voice is a subtle little phaser, and I used the Sound Toys phaser, the Phase Mistress, which is personally my favorite phaser plugin. I'm a big fan of Sound Toys stuff.
Always seem to get here, you and I. No one really knows me like your eyes.
An effect I used on the delay is actually an effect that's really common in rap for the most part, where you sidechain the delay with the actual lead vocal so that the delay is never happening while the vocal needs its presence, but when the vocal is absent, the delay swoops back in again and takes its place. During my verse, Miriam did these really pretty backups, and I'm a big fan of them. I think they sound dope.
We always seem to get here, you and I. Just me and no one else. Could you get by? Between me and all those boys, am I your favorite toy? Or am I just the one that passed your eye? So tell me it's a sin for me to want you to myself.
I think the phaser is really most obvious in situations like that where Miriam and I's vocals are happening at the same time. Like right in there, you could really hear it crisply in that last refrain there, as well as in the following section during the
guitar verse,
where we're singing the tell me, don't tell me.
Tell me, tell me, don't tell me, don't tell me. Tell me, tell me, don't tell me, don't tell me.
I really think the phaser added with those like harmonies really just kind of makes it all like wavy, and I'm a big fan of that kind of a sound. Arguably the coolest part of the vocals though definitely comes in during the big refrain, where they're just absolutely destroyed. First I run them through Isotope Trash on the Compressor Faker preset. Then following that they go through Supercharger, which is an actual real compressor. Then they go through the stock Pro Tools Distortion, and then finally through another Phase Mistress. And together, those all make it sound like this.
Just tell me once again, like how you tell all of your friends, how it's just such a fucking sin for me to want you to myself.
So that's a pretty marked difference between the vocal section there versus the chill, more relaxed vocals that are at the start. Especially, my favorite part of that is when the phaser kicks in really hard right at the end there on those last notes. I think it leads nicely into the synth solo.
You to myself.
The final section of vocals is in that like overture bit, Miriam had this really cool idea where I would produce it so that her vocals kind of sounded like an effect on mine rather than just sounding like a separate present vocal. And then the other vocal effect going on in this section is an echo boy delay of a 16th note, and that's panned hard left, but it's like fairly, there's no like reverb on it or anything, so it's very dry.
Tell me it's a sin. Tell me how I played the fool again. I just want you to myself, just for myself. You could tell me once again. Tell me so I'm sure not to forget, even when I'm by myself.
And then the verb feeds back on this section to lead into the end. And for that little verb sweep, I just used realm on morph effects. Then I automated the volume to sweep it up into the end. Speaking of the end, it's time to talk about my favorite parts of songs. All the weird sounds. So, like I said, I already talked about the little end verb sweep that happens on my vocals right there, but another cool sound that happens near the end is the transition in between the end of that synth solo bridge B section into the overture, where there's like a delay that like slows down and has the pitch go down with it. So for that, it comes from the guitars, and I used Echo Boy, as pretty much always, and then I just automated the tempo to go down so the pitch would follow with it. So in context, that would sound like this. And I think it leads pretty nicely into the overture. Also in the overture, near the very end, we have the sample from the start of Fool so that that transition is smooth, like this. And then all the ambient birds. I kind of went in on the birds, low-key. So I had a sample of birds in a forest, and it's mostly like ambient background, like forest noises and like little bird chirps and stuff, but every once in a while there's like a big front, like very present bird chirp. And so I took that sample and I cut out every time that there was a big like present bird chirp and stitched all of what's left together to make this kind of like background quiet thing. And then I actually took that big bird chirp, sampled it in Iris 2, and made that like a synth almost, but it's just the bird noises. I didn't really do anything to it, but I played the bird notes in the chords that were playing in the overture. So that sounds like this. And then in my opinion, the coolest part of all of it is that the first chord of the overture, that F sharp major 7, is 1/2 step below the first chord of Fool, which is a G major 7. So at the very end of the birds, they do like an F sharp to G, like half step raise to make the transition into Fool feel a little bit more natural. And that's my section of Sin, so on to Clayton for the drums and synths. That's all for my section of the breakdown on Sin, so I'll pass it on over to Clayton so he can do the drums and the synths. Oh, and before I forget, one more thing I actually totally forgot to talk about entirely is some of the effects on the drums, specifically the parallel compression I used to get the intensity on the big refrain. So for that, I ran the drums in parallel through that supercharger, and then through the Ozone 9 vintage compressor with harsh ratio, low threshold, small attack, and short release. And so that, on the drums, brings a huge difference in tonality between what comes right before it in bridge A and in the big refrain. So that's like this. And so that extra intensity in the drums really just drives home the intensity of that refrain, and I think is honestly one of the coolest things you can do to drums.
Heyo, we're in my room now. I'm just going to be talking about a bunch of synth noises that are in Syn, because there's like 5 and they're all relatively cool. And I'll be talking about a couple of the drum parts, and I'll wrap up. I just want to talk about like a little unused section of the song. We'll just dive into the first synth noise. It's really not that obvious. We pretty much just use it for like ambience in the first couple parts of the song. I just call it the chill synth on here. It sounds like this. It's just a sine wave, and then there's delay and reverb on it. Everyone knows what that is. The hyperdimension effect is kind of basically 2 effects in one. The hyper part of the effect is like very quick micro detuned unisons that make it sound fuller, and then the rate is basically the rate at which it plays these detunings, and then you can also control how detuned they are. And so I just dialed it in until I thought it sounded like full, but before it turned ridiculous. Then the dimension gives the effect of it sounding more wide. It's actually a like pseudo effect. It doesn't actually make it wider, but it makes it sound like it is. So that's that noise. It's also in the guitar solo section of the song, but it's like higher up pitch wise. So it kind of has this like effect. Pretty neat. Just adds some texture to the song. Besides that, nothing else super interesting happens drum or synth-wise until the first part of the bridge A. Then it just kind of all goes crazy out of nowhere, like it's that part of the song. This whole section was based off a song by Hippocampus called Doubt. They have like a crazy section, just like a lot of instruments playing, like syncopated and crazy. So that was kind of the goal with this section. It's in 5/4, and so for those who don't know like anything about music theory, most music that you hear on the radio for the most part is in 4/4, and so each measure you just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But when it's 5/4, it just means there's 5 beats in a measure, so there's an extra beat. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So I'll play just the drum part first because it's a very interesting drum part that is super fun to play. I just love, it's pretty linear. Like you don't really hit too many things at the same time, but there's just a lot of interesting like voicing choices between the bass and the hi-hat and the snare and some toms and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool. I'll play that. So that's the drums in that part. Now in this part, there's actually 3 synths, and they're all doing their own thing. So the first 2 they're actually pretty similar. This one I have labeled Wacky Synth because it's pretty wacky. I'll play that real quick. It sounds like this. So this sound is another sine wave, but the wavetable position, which is this knob right here, is altered so that it's like kind of like a messed up sine wave, like there's just a little bit of weirdness to it. And then in the effects department going on, there's distortion, phaser, chorus, and reverb. For this sound, you know, the chorus and reverb aren't really that much, they're not really a big deal. They're just kind of doing their chorus and reverby things. But the distortion, which gives it like that growl, and the phaser, which gives it that like you can hear the phasing, like it's hard to describe, but it's like that type of thing. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. Those are the 2 things giving like the sound character. The next synth, which is labeled the distortion synth, doubles most of what's going on in Wacky Synth, but this sound has a different type of a distortion. I found that this preset called downsample, it adds like random like lower harmonics just randomly, and I thought it sounds super cool. So I'll kind of give you an idea of what that sounds like. And then moving on to this next little part right here. So there you can see how like I didn't write lower notes. It's the same part as the wacky synth, just it adds on its own these lower frequencies that sound super cool. And I had to dial in like the gain and stuff and how much distortion there was, because if there's any more, like it starts adding tones that weren't in the key, and that just sounded bad. So it really took a lot of knob adjusting to get it the way it is. The last synth in this section, which is pretty much the main synth, I labeled it the primary synth, kind of started the whole idea for this section. Sounds like this. Fun fact about like the melody going on is actually based off, Quinn wrote this guitar riff in 5/4 that we couldn't figure out how to do anything with, and so I kind of altered it and put it in this song, and it was just crazy enough to work. And so that's how that came to be, kind of how the whole section came to be. But going into the sound, it's not too different from the others, except in the sense that it has hyper and distortion in it. I think this gives it like that bounciness that is kind of required of the part. The last thing I want to do in this section is just play all the synths and the drums together. I think it's interesting to hear them without the context of the guitars and bass and stuff that is also going on. So that these sound like this. Moving on to the next section, which is like this big, intense build-up. It keeps using the wacky synth, which just keeps holding these long notes that are ascending in pitch, which sounds like this. Then there's another synth noise I added, which I don't even really know what the heck it is. I haven't looked at it. It's pretty much that's what I thought. It's pretty much the same as the primary synth noise. It sounds like this. So these two synths were actually written after this whole section was written, just to help give it a little bit more intensity, the ascending pitch and distortion like that. The drums in this section are pretty cool. They're pretty just bombastic, hitting random things, just slowly building up, getting faster and faster. So I'll play them real quick, just soloed out. So this all leads into the huge bridge B section, the kind of the climax of the song. The sounds I used here are the primary synth as kind of like the lead noise. And then the drums just go into this huge like halftime, like slower feel, but like really epic. So the two of those together sound like this. So that's that. It's pretty much one of my favorite parts of the EP, probably my favorite part of the EP, especially to play. It's just so epic. An interesting part about this section is there actually is an unused synth part. It got pretty much replaced with guitars and stuff, which I'm happy with. But we'll probably use this sound in later songs. It's just really low, distorted sine wave synth noise. It sounds like this. In context with the other things, it sounds like this. Anyway, I think that's pretty cool. That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. The last thing I'll go into here is using that that unused synth noise. There actually is an unused part to this song. Sadly, I got rid of the drums and some of the other parts that were written for this section, but the kind of the low synth noise part for it is still here. So it was gonna sound like this. You know, that was about it. It was like a drum part with like some accents. This was going to lead into the huge bridge B part, but it ended up flowing way better just to go from straight from the intense refrain right into the final climax of the song. But yeah, in terms of the synths I added to this song and drum parts, you know, that's about it. That's what it is. And I think it's interesting to hear them kind of isolated outside of the song, and they're fun to make. So yeah, peace out.